Thank you, Speaker, and I'm pleased to speak to Bill 70, an act to implement budget measures and to enact and amend various statutes. And I do so, Speaker, from my experience as a senior civil servant with the Ministry of Revenue, and from the perspective I've gained in my role as the official opposition critic for advanced education and skills development. And Speaker, it's a portfolio I've immersed myself in since I was elected in February 2016. And I've heard a lot about the challenges facing our university, colleges and skills trade sector while visiting over 30 campuses and trade organizations across the province. Speaker, by taking a comprehensive look at the state of advanced education and skills development, you certainly get a clear sense of where we are as a province. The minds being educated today, Speaker, will in fact shape the economic fortunes of tomorrow. There's no question that during my tour, I heard far and wide about the skills gap that exists in our province, one which the government has failed to address yet again in Bill 70. Speaker, every failed policy decision that this government has made over the last 13 years continues to make life harder and more unaffordable for Ontarians. And no economic statement is going to change that. Quite frankly, the government's omnibus legislation is simply a distraction and has nothing to do with improving the economic well-being of Ontarians. Speaker, in order to balance the budget in 2017 and 2018, the fall economic statement indicates the government has reduced its contingency reserve by $600 million and is seeking another $800 million, Speaker, through the one-time sale of government assets. The government has no plan to get our books back on track that doesn't involve higher taxes or hydro rates, more fire sales of government assets, or cuts to frontline services. Let's turn for a moment, Speaker, and take a look at the broad macroeconomic numbers. The government's rosary rhetoric in the statement notes that the provincial economy is now growing and that relatively strong growth is expected in the years to come. But it's important to recognize, Speaker, just how severe and prolonged Ontario's economic slump has been before popping the champagne to celebrate a brief uptick in growth. Speaker, consider that from 2003 to 2015, per person economic growth and adjusting for inflation in Ontario increased at an average annual rate of 0.5%. Speaker, that's anemic growth over a long period of time and is approximately half the growth rate in the rest of Canada. Weak economic growth is not just a matter of economic concern. It has hit Ontario families hard in the pocketbook. Consider, Speaker, that in 2000, average disposable household income in Ontario was 10% higher than in the rest of the country. Prolonged poor economic performance has meant that Ontario's average income since 2012, Speaker, is now below the rest of the country. It's below the rest of the country. Ontarians having income below the national average is historically unthinkable and probably quite difficult for those who are watching this afternoon to comprehend. Put simply, Speaker, the average Ontarian is now poorer than the average Canadian. A potent symbol of Ontario's economic slide came in 2009, Speaker, when the province became eligible for equalization payments, becoming a have-not province for the first time in its history. Speaker, it's a situation that would have been almost unmanageable a generation ago. Speaker, 7 years later, however, the receipt of equalization payments has simply become business as usual in Ontario. What's clear, Speaker? What's clear is it will take more than a few quarters, even a few years of strong economic growth to undo all of this damage and restore Ontario as an economic engine in Canada. Speaker, if this is what economic success and a working plan looks like, it's hard to imagine what might constitute failure in the government's eyes. If the government's willingness to brag about its economic record is cringeworthy, Speaker, its willingness to brag about the success of its management of provincial finances is almost surreal. The economic update says the province is on track to beat its deficit target this year, and that it will return to a balanced budget in 2017-18. And this is supposed to be evidence of the government's prudent fiscal management. The numbers themselves, however, Speaker, tell a very different story. In reality, the government is on track this year to run its 9th consecutive multi-billion-dollar budget deficit. Since 2003, Ontario's debt, after adjusting for financial assets, has grown faster than any other province in Canada. Now, Speaker, the government may well finally balance its budget next year, which includes its spending on day-to-day items, although its own Financial Accountability Office has cast some doubt that it will. Even so, the government will continue to rack up debt in the years ahead. In fact, the Financial Accountability Officer projects that the government's debt burden will increase by more than $50 billion in the years ahead, reaching $370 billion by 2020. Speaker, the notion that a return to an artificial balanced budget next year means the fiscal plan is working, or that Ontario's battered finances are on the road to recovery, is frankly nothing more than spin. The rosy fiscal and economic rhetoric surrounding last week's economic update is disconnected. Speaker, is disconnected from the economic realities facing Ontarians and from the realities of the government's own finances. Speaker, I look at the land transfer tax changes as an example, and I see nothing more than a distraction tactic. We've heard in this House that we have a major housing crisis in so many of Ontario municipalities, and while it may be appealing for first-time buyers in some parts of Ontario to receive a credit prior to closing, there are more critical housing issues that should be addressed. And the land transfer tax benefit for first-time purchasers is offset in part by an increase in that same tax on wealthier purchasers. Now, Speaker, a senior economist at BMO Nesbitt Burns has said that doubling the rebate will do little for purchasers in Toronto, where skyrocketing values have made it all but impossible for first-time purchasers to contemplate. With runaway home prices in Toronto, the rebates will not create the incentive necessary for the first-time buyers that the amendment is intended to assist. Speaker, every day, and I'm sure you do as well, I receive notes from my constituents and other concerned Ontario residents about the energy crisis in this province. And these stories are heart-wrenching. People having to choose between keeping the lights on or basic necessities. Hard-working Ontario families are choosing to pay for food over their hydro bills. Speaker, they simply have no money left to spare. And Speaker, businesses are either leaving Ontario or electing to expand operations in other jurisdictions, in large part because of the burdensome red tape and certainly because the energy costs are crippling production. But Speaker, this omnibus legislation does nothing to address the single largest economic issue in this province, and that's runaway energy prices. Speaker, this omission highlights the simple fact that this government is out of touch with the demands of Ontario residents. This omnibus bill amends 27 statutes, repeals 3, and enacts 4 new ones. But what's glaring, Speaker, what is particularly glaring, is the incredibly stark reality that only a minimal number of the changes actually impact the economics of Ontario. And I fail to understand, Speaker, how a government purportedly intent on getting our economic engine moving again can take any comfort from the directions and content of Bill 70. And I fail to see why the government thinks that the residents of this province will be supportive of amendments to the Assessment Act or the Crown Employers and Collective Bargaining Act or the creation of interim appropriation for the 217-218 Act. Speaker, they can't pay their hydro bills. They can't afford basic necessities. And they face enormous obstacles in having their aging parents obtain affordable assisted living, and furthermore, their children are finding it increasingly difficult to find jobs. These are some of the real issues, Speaker, not a tweak to the Commodity Futures Act. This government, Speaker, must get a grip on the realities facing the average man or woman in our province. When you step back, Speaker, Bill 70 seems to have been created in a vacuum, far removed from appreciating the everyday stresses faced by each of us every single day. Now, Speaker, as I said at the outset of my speech, I spent months visiting universities, community colleges, and career colleges across Ontario, and I listened and I learned. For too long, Ontario has allowed its investment in universities to fall behind. And for 6 consecutive years, Ontario has ranked last of all the provinces for per student funding. In fact, adjusted for inflation, Speaker, Ontario's per student funding is now at its lowest point since the government began building capacity and expanding access in the 1960s. The ongoing review of the university funding formula, Speaker, must produce results that will improve the stability and adequacy of funding. Risky proposals for unproven and inequitable performance funding schemes must be rejected. For students and faculty already feeling the squeeze produced by misallocated funding, it's crucial that any revised model prioritizes accessible and high-quality education. Speaker, years of inappropriate public investment, over $1 billion wasted on gas plants comes to mind, is threatening universities' ability to fulfill their core missions of teaching and research at the highest standard. A recommitment to appropriate application of public funding for Ontario universities is the only path forward for ensuring high-quality post-secondary education across Ontario. Speaker, this legislation also does nothing to mend the skills gap, which continues to spiral out of control in this province under this government's watch. It continues to grow, and all the government can say is that they're conducting another review. Speaker, this government has had 13 years to conduct reviews. Parents in Ontario want to know that their sons and daughters can leave university, community college, or an apprenticeship with a real opportunity to start a career. Speaker, they want to know that when their son or daughter is attending school or within an apprenticeship, they're able to translate these new skills and knowledge into a career of their choice. Yet, Speaker, we hear from the Ontario Chamber of Commerce that the skills gap is costing our economy $24.3 billion a year and $3.7 billion in foregone tax revenue. Speaker, it's time for this government to take real action and stop graduating people for yesterday's jobs. But, Speaker, it's not just higher education where this government is earning a failing grade. We also see it in our primary and secondary schools. Speaker, half of Ontario's grade 6 students are failing to meet the provincial standards for mathematics. And there are 33 school boards in our province, as I stand here today, that are below the provincial average for math between 2014 and 2016. But, Speaker, instead of dealing with the issues of education, the government creates Bill 70. And the people of Ontario want government to take positive action on the economy, undertaking initiatives that will assist them in improving their lives. The people of Ontario want this province to be a great place to raise a family, the best place to live, And Bill 70, Speaker, does very little to address the serious economic issues like hydro and education. Speaker, we do not support the economic policy of this government, and we certainly do not support Bill 70. We have a debt crisis in our once great province. Ontario now is the single most indebted sub-sovereign borrower in the world. That is such an incredible statement to have to make. And we have twice the debt of California. Speaker, the Financial Accountability Officer has confirmed the province's net debt is set to rise by over $64 billion by 2020-21 to a record $370 billion, and that Ontario will continue to be the largest subnational borrower on the planet. This government spends more than $11 billion a year in interest on the debt alone, Speaker, which is money that we could be investing in our province's future. That amounts to more every year paying interest on our debt than we do, Speaker, on post-secondary funding. We spend more every year serving a debt, Speaker, than we do on post-secondary education in this province. We're quite literally, Speaker, making future generations pay for the mistakes this government's fiscal imprudence and reckless approach to governing. It's outrageous, and quite clearly, the public has grown tired of it. Yes, Speaker, despite racking up all this debt, the government claims they're going to balance the budget right before the election. And as my colleague, the member of Provincial Parliament for Nipissing, rightly points out, it's an artificial balance. And earlier this year, the Financial Accountability Officer told us that the government is using the one-time money from asset sales and contingency funds to artificially balance the budget in an election year. And this government seems intent on balancing the budget on the backs of Ontario taxpayers by selling the valued assets of the province to prop up a balance sheet that has become unsupportable. Now, Speaker, I know you've heard me speak about how this government has no comprehensive or coherent legislative agenda. In fact, I was just mentioning this very point to Cody Welton, a member of our House Leader's staff, as I entered the chamber this afternoon. But the government's had 13 years to get it right, and in my estimation, they failed. They failed the hard-working people of Ontario, and they've left a wake of scandal, waste, and mismanagement in their path, Speaker. A sea of mistakes. But what's clear, Speaker? What's clear? As the clock runs out on this government, one can only hope they will look in the mirror, dig deep, and put forward some comprehensive policies to help take this province off the dire course they've set. Though, Speaker, at the end of the day, I won't be holding my breath. Thank you.